1 Corinthians 10 is the last of the 3 chapters in 1 Corinthians that deals with Christian liberty. Specifically, the question is, are we able to, in Corinth 2,000 years ago, are we able to eat meat that is sacrificed to idols? Now, that's not a question I've ever asked. It's probably not a question you've ever asked, but it's a question they asked in that congregation 2,000 years ago. Is it okay? Can we eat meat that is offered to idols? After all, there are no false gods. Those don't exist. Zeus and Hermes and Apollo and Diana, they're not real. That's the preaching of the first century apostles, that the gods that are made are not gods at all. And if those gods aren't real, does it really matter that we eat food that's been offered to them first? The reason why this takes 3 chapters of 1 Corinthians is because Paul uses this one case study of can I eat meat offered to idols as an example to teach all of us, no matter what generation and where we live, to teach all of us about Christian liberty and how to exercise it. And the bottom line is, just because you are at liberty to do something, just because you can do something as a Christian, doesn't necessarily mean that you should do something. But then the question becomes, all right, well, what are the criteria by which I gauge whether I should do something or not? If I've got liberty, if I've got freedom, for example, to eat meat offered to idols, and Paul says in chapter 8 that you can, yes, if I've got that right, if I've got that liberty, then, by what criteria do I decide that I shouldn't do that? That's where 1 Corinthians 10 comes in. And so what we're going to do this morning, I've got my fancy marking pen up here, and we're just going to talk about what the chapter is arguing with us, how it's trying to convince us that it's not always right, it's not always the best thing to eat meat that's been offered to idols, and the principles and the precepts and the commands that come with this. And so, by the way, this has a lot of application, a lot of different areas of our lives. We are supposed to be thoughtful people. We're supposed to think as Christians about what we should and what we shouldn't do, what we can and what we can't do. But then it's not just about you, and it's not just about me and what I have the liberty to do. It's also about my brethren and what's best for the cause of Christ. And 1 Corinthians 10:31, what glorifies God? That's a question that has to be asked as well. And so the first thing Paul does in 1 Corinthians 10 is he's answering this question. By the way, at the end of chapter 9, he says, I buffet my body, I discipline my body. And what he means by that is, I willingly give up things that I have the right to do. I willingly give those up, lest I should become disqualified. In other words, I may have the ability and the liberty to do some things, but if I don't restrain myself, if I don't control myself, I might lose my soul anyway because of the attitudes and the relationships and the difficulties that come from always exercising my liberty. And so what he's doing in chapter 10 is just continuing that line of thought, that line of reasoning. The first thing he does in the first 13 or so verses of 1 Corinthians 10 is he says, Christians, you need to consider the example of the Old Testament Israelites. That's on your handout. Consider the example of the Old Testament Israelites. And what he does in these first 5 verses, I wasn't quite sure how small that would be. Hopefully some of you could read it. In these first 5 verses, he talks about the benefits and the blessings that the Old Testament Israelites enjoyed. Let me highlight for you some of those. Okay, as you look at this passage, I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers, talking about the Old Testament Israelites, our fathers were all under the cloud. And not only that, they all passed through the sea. And not only that, all were baptized into Moses. And all ate the same spiritual food. And all drank the same spiritual drink. Okay, what's he doing there? He's giving you 5 examples of how the Old Testament Israelites enjoyed the grace and the blessings of God. They all were under the cloud. They all passed through the sea. He's talking about the Red Sea. They all were baptized, used as a metaphor here, into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And there is an argument for New Testament baptism here, because what he's saying is he's making the experience of the Israelites in the wilderness a parallel to the experience of Christians. That's what he wants you to see. they enjoyed and were blessed by the grace of God. And they were baptized into Moses. Okay, they were immersed. They went through the cloud and the sea. The water was covering them. And then verse 3, they all ate the same spiritual food. They all drank the same spiritual drink. Christians eat spiritual food and we drink spiritual drink. And especially, he's going to mention in just a few verses, the Lord's Supper. Eating the body and drinking the blood of Christ. And how that shows grace and fellowship and communion with God. And he's saying here, those Israelites, they had a lot of the same kinds of blessings, even if it was manifested in a little bit different way, same kinds of blessings that Christians have. He even goes on at the end of verse 4, they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. And one of the interesting things about this is, Paul is arguing here that Jesus was with those Israelites in the wilderness in the Old Testament. Jesus didn't just show up in Matthew chapter 1 or Luke chapter 2. He didn't just appear on the scene and, that's the first time anybody's ever seen or heard anything about Jesus. No, he was there, according to this passage, back in the wilderness. John would argue that he created all things. John chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. And so, but Christ was with them, just like Christ is with us, New Testament Christians now. And so, after highlighting all these blessings, Paul goes on to say, nevertheless, nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, and they were overthrown in the wilderness. The warning for people who are in danger of abusing their liberty or not thinking enough about their liberty, the warning here is that even though you enjoy the grace of God, even though you enjoy the blessings of being a Christian, even though you enjoy fellowship with God and you're eating spiritual food and drinking spiritual drink, all those things, you still might behave in such a way that you displease God and that you are overthrown, that you are cut off. So the warning is, Israel enjoyed all these blessings and yet they lost their relationship. They lost and they were overthrown. They were condemned in the wilderness. He goes on in verses 6 through 9 to give some color to this, to give some examples of this. It says, these things, Israel falling, they took place as examples for us, that we, Christians, might not desire evil as they did. So why are those things written in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy? Why are the experiences of the Israelites in the wilderness written there? Not just for the Old Testament Jews, but also for New Testament Christians. The Old Testament has value, according to this passage. We ought to go back to the Old Testament and learn about how those people related to God, and that's going to affect how we respond. It's supposed to teach us. It's supposed to instruct us. And then what Paul does in the next couple of verses is he gives you 4 examples of what Israelites did that led to their condemnation. 4 examples. Here they are. He says, do not be idolaters as some of them were. And then he says again in verse 8, we must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did. And then he says, we must not put Christ to the test as some of them did. And then a 4th thing, we ought not to grumble as some of them did. So if you're looking at verses 7 through 9, or 7 through 10, 4 areas in which Israel stumbled and fell. 4 areas in which they were so close to what is sinful and they got so involved in what is sinful that they lost their blessings. They lost their grace that they had. The first area is idolatry. And he's referring specifically, if you're taking notes, to Exodus 32. When Moses went up on the mountain and he was there with God, the Bible tells us that the people, they had Aaron build them a golden calf. And then Aaron put the calf out in front of the people and said, here is your God, O Israel, that delivered you from captivity. And the people bowed down to worship and they rose up to play. Sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. He's quoting Exodus 32 there. So they became close to idolatry. Now think about what Paul's arguing here. Don't lose sight of the big picture. The early Christians are asking, can I eat meat that's been offered to idols, right? Is that a problem? Because we know that there's no such thing as Zeus, so is it okay for me to go ahead and eat some meat that's already been offered to Zeus? He's not real. And Paul says, Don't become idolatrous like some of them were. He's saying if you're getting too close to this kind of thing, there's a real danger that you might start giving in to some of this. Again, don't indulge in sexual immorality, which is often associated with idolatry in the Old and New Testament, as some of them did. And now he's quoting from Numbers 25, or alluding to it. Numbers chapter 25. Some of the Israelites in Numbers 25, verse 1, began to commit sexual immorality with the women of Moab. And this was celebrating and worshiping idols. That was very common in the ancient world. It's not quite so uncommon even in our world, just not in this country so much, where sexual immorality is one of the ways in which you give honor and homage to a god. And so don't indulge in that, as some of them did, because that's another thing that's associated with idol worship. He goes on and says in verse 9, don't put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and were destroyed by serpents. That's Numbers 21. So if you're taking notes, Exodus 32, Numbers 25, now Numbers 21. They put Christ to the test. And what that means is Israel in their history, as they were wandering in the wilderness, continually kept asking the question, why has God led us out here to the wilderness to die? Why is he not feeding us and giving us something to drink? And they're constantly putting him to the test. And the putting to the test is basically just asking this question, is God with us or not? Rather than trusting the evidence that God had given them and trusting the words that Christ had given them, they were saying, is he with us? Is he not with us? They were putting him to the test in that regard. And so God sent fiery serpents when they complained on that occasion in Numbers 21. And then the fourth area in which they sinned is they grumbled. This seems to be a reference to Numbers 13 and 14. Numbers 13 and 14, when they came to Kadesh Barnea, and the spies went into the land, and they came back with the negative report. Remember the 10 spies? They're giants in the land. No way we can ever take the land. And the people started to whine and complain, and the idea of being destroyed by the destroyer there at the end of verse 10, God told that entire generation, you're going to perish in the wilderness. Only Joshua and Caleb, only those two are going to go into the land in Numbers 14 after 40 years. And that seems to be what Paul is describing there in verse 10. And so the big picture of all this, again, Exodus 32, Numbers 25, Numbers 21, Numbers 14, the big picture here is that you need to be careful and consider the example of the Old Testament Israelites. God blessed them in every way they needed. He gave them everything they could possibly require and more. He fed them every day. They didn't have to go out and forage for food. It was right there on the ground when they opened their tent flap in the morning. And yet, because of their hearts and their sinful attitudes, many of them perished in the wilderness. And Paul is saying, look, you may have liberty as a Christian. You may have the ability to do some things, and it's not wrong. It's not inherently sinful what you're proposing to do. You may have that ability. You better think about these people first. And you better think about what happened to them before you go on freely and without any further thought doing what you believe you have the liberty to do. And so he comes to this in verse 11 of 1 Corinthians 10. These things, happened to them as an example. He's already said that once. He said it back in verse 6. These things happened to them as an example. They were written down for our instruction, Christians, upon whom the end of the ages has come. Therefore, let anyone who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. And that's kind of the key to the chapter in verse 12. The key to the chapter is you may have the right and the ability to do some things, and yet by the way you exercise that right, by the way that you exercise that privilege, that liberty, you still may fall. Be careful with your liberty. That's his lesson. That's his point. Just because you've got the right to do it doesn't mean it's right to do. I like that. Maybe I'll coin that, market it. I don't know. Just because you have the right doesn't mean it's right. Okay? That's the point of this chapter. And he's going to go on and elaborate on that in the next verses to come. Any questions, thoughts just yet? Okay? All right. So, verse 13, since he's been talking about temptation, and the kinds of temptations he's been talking about specifically are things like sexual immorality and idolatry, idol worship, and grumbling and wondering if God's really with us. Those are temptations that he's been talking about here. And he says, look, there's no temptation that you're facing that's not common to man. In other words, these temptations are present just about everywhere, but especially when you're thinking about these areas of liberty in context of this discussion, you got to think about where you're going to be tempted. Even though you've got the right to do something, what temptations are being opened? What temptations are being presented? I said in a lesson a couple of weeks ago, maybe it was last week, I don't know, I've slept since then. It's not wrong to be tempted. Like in and of itself, it's not wrong to be tempted. However, having said that, I mean, it's what you do with the temptation that matters. Are you going to give in to the temptation, or are you going to overcome the temptation? Are you going to fight against it? That's really where the struggle is. Having said that, it is wholeheartedly unwise and sometimes wrong, downright wrong, for a Christian to run toward temptation or to put ourselves in a place where we know we're going to be tempted because we kind of enjoy the being tempted. That's wrong. And so Paul is saying, no temptation's overtaken you that's not common to man, but here's the thing. God is faithful, and this is one of the great promises of the New Testament. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but rather with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. And so, just because you're in a context or a situation where you're facing temptation doesn't mean that you're forced to give into it. In fact, this promise says the opposite. This promise says, in every situation where you face temptation, there's always a way of escape. All you have to do is look for it. But, listen carefully, and put this in your notes if you're writing notes down. The way of escape is usually really hard. The way of escape is usually very difficult. It's painful. And there will be consequences when you take the way of escape. So, you're tempted to do the wrong thing, you decide to do the right thing instead. Doing the right thing is costly, it's painful, but there is a way of escape. That's the promise of this passage. Therefore, my beloved, verse 14, I put this with the first 13 verses. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. Yeah, sure. You've got the right to eat meat that's been offered to idols. He said that's okay back in chapter 8. But now he says, flee from idolatry. What's the takeaway here? The takeaway here is that sometimes we think very, very wrong about our liberty. We ask questions like these. Listen carefully. We ask questions like, what's wrong with it? Where does the Bible say I can't? And we can ask those questions, and there is an argument to be made, okay? That's one way to approach things. I'm just telling you, and Paul's telling you here, those are not the only questions you ought to ask. If the only thing you ever think about in making a decision is what's wrong with it and where does the Bible say I can't, you are on a very dangerous path. Take heed lest you fall. Don't say, well, it'll never happen to me. I would never fall into idolatry or into sexual immorality, or I would never be guilty of questioning God's love and his presence. I'd never be guilty of grumbling against the blessings of God. Don't say it'll never happen to me. The Bible's telling you, consider those Old Testament Israelites when they were walking through the Red Sea, being baptized into Moses. Yeah, they thought things were great. I mean, look at what God's done for us. He's providing for us. But it wasn't long, and it happened repeatedly in their history, that they kept on sinning and they kept on displeasing God. And most of them were destroyed in the wilderness. So, what's wrong with it? That's never the only question you should ask. This passage would teach that. What's wrong with it? Why can't I? Where does the Bible say I can't? That is not the only question that needs to be asked. We need to think about why we're doing what we're doing. Questions, thoughts about any of this? Part one. So, can you eat meat offered to idols? Well, you better think about those Old Testament Israelites. That's the first thing Paul says. Then the second thing he says is, verses 15 through 22, can I eat meat offered to idols? You better consider the danger of minimizing evil. That's on your handout too. Consider the danger of minimizing evil. This is the attitude that says, folks, I know what I'm doing, and don't worry, I can handle it. I know what I'm doing, don't worry, it's not going to affect me. Be careful with that attitude. Oh, it won't bother me, it won't affect me. Other people may have a problem, they may struggle with this, but I won't struggle with this. That's what he's dealing with now. Okay? So, look at verse 15, and I just want you to think about this for a moment. It's worth just taking a second. I speak as to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. Folks, the Bible tells us that we are supposed to engage our brains, and we are supposed to think about what is and isn't God's will for our lives. God didn't just give us a bunch of lists in His Word, although there are things that are requirements. He didn't just give us a bunch of lists and say, well, if you follow list number 1 and list number 3 and list number 8, don't worry about anything else. No, God calls us continually to use our minds and to think about the questions of life that are often quite complicated and quite difficult. And He says, I'm speaking to you and I'm appealing to your sensibility, to your ability to reason logically about things. Judge for yourselves what I say. Okay? So, If you're just going to say, you know what, I can handle this. I can handle the meat offered to idols. It doesn't bother me. I have knowledge. An idol is nothing. You better use your mind. Be careful about minimizing evil and saying it's not going to affect you. And what he does next in verses 16 and following is he gives 3 examples. And the key word here is communion, participation. The cup of blessing that we bless, verse 16, is it not participation in the blood of Christ? The bread that we break. He's talking about the Lord's Supper very, very transparently. It's the Lord's Supper. The bread that we break, is it not a participation or a communion in the body of Christ? When we eat the Lord's Supper, we often call it communion. Where did we get that word? Where did that come from? It came from this passage. This is where it's called communion. It's called koinonia. That's the Greek word, koinonia. Koinonia means fellowship. It means sharing. It means participation. It means engagement. And so what Paul is writing here is he's saying, when you eat the Lord's Supper, you are participating, you are sharing in the body and the blood of Christ. Side note, just for a moment, people who are not believers and are not yet Christians should not eat the Lord's Supper. It's not something that we ought to be ugly about, but the Bible would say that eating the Lord's Supper it's a matter of sharing in and participating in something that we enjoy the blessings of. We have been saved by Jesus. He has washed our sins away, and those who are not in Christ in the sense that they have believed and repented and been baptized should not be eating the Lord's Supper. It is participation, it is communion, it is fellowship with Christ and with His people. All right, side note's over. Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of one bread. He's just talking about, it's not just vertical fellowship, it's horizontal fellowship. When we eat the Lord's Supper, we're saying we have fellowship and connection with one another because of what Jesus has done, because of His body and His blood. All right? Now, keep your eye on that word participation here in the ESV, communion in some of your translations. Now he's going to give 2 more examples. You see, back here, it's the Lord's Supper that he's talking about, verses 15 through 18, or verse 15 through 17. And now he's also going to give another example. Consider the Old Testament Israelites, he says, are not those who eat the sacrifices participants in the altar? So what he's saying now is, because if you go back and read Leviticus, the way the sacrifices were done, some of the sacrifices, you were commanded, after you'd offered your goat or your bull or whatever it was, you were commanded to take part of that and eat it. And that was sharing in, that was part of your fellowship with God and with the people of God under the Old Testament system. And so you're taking the bull and you're offering parts of it to God, and you're taking other parts of it and you're offering it and sharing it in a meal with other people. You're eating the sacrifice that you have offered to God. And he's saying in verse 18, in Old Testament Israel, they were participating, they were communing in the altar. That is, they're saying, I'm part of this process. Okay? And then verse 19, what do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No. All right? He's been saying this since chapter 8. No. The food offered to idols, the idol itself, no. Those things, okay, those are matters of indifference. They're matters of liberty. But here's something you haven't thought about, Christian, you sensible people who I'm appealing to your judgment. Here's something you probably haven't thought about. What pagans sacrifice, they are offering to demons and not to God. And I don't want you to be participants, koinonia, with demons. Now, this is a really interesting argument Paul makes, because he's been telling people, and he's been preaching, like, there's no such thing as Zeus. There's no such thing as Diana. They do not exist except in people's minds, and they're idols that are made with hands. And he's in the Old Testament tradition when he makes that argument, because Isaiah, like, read the last 27 chapters of Isaiah. It is the longest extended defense of monotheism anywhere in the Bible. 27 chapters of relentless God saying, I'm the only God there is. There is none other besides me. Go ask your gods if they can do what I can do, if they know what I know, if they're able to help you in the way that I can help you. That's what Isaiah is doing. And Paul's just carrying that over. He's saying, look, we know as Christians there's no such thing as Zeus. There's no such thing as Apollo. They don't exist. But you know what does exist? Demons. They are real. They're not gods. They're not on the level with God. In fact, God created them. Colossians 1:16. God created everything that's both visible and invisible. More specifically, Christ created everything that's both visible and invisible in Colossians 1:16. But those demons, those fallen angels, that's what I believe they are, they really exist. And guess who wants you to worship idols? The demons do. So, even though an idol is nothing, and even though food offered to idols isn't anything, there are demonic forces that have presented idolatry to the world. That's his argument. And when you go down to the pagan temple and you just say, well, I'm a Christian, I'm enlightened, and I'd like to order off the value menu, at the pagan temple, and I like to sit down and eat there in the pagan temple. You better be careful what you're saying by your outward actions. Because you see, when you eat the Lord's Supper, by your outward actions, you're saying, I am in fellowship with Christ and his people, his body and his blood. I'm in fellowship with those things. By their outward actions, when those Old Testament Israelites ate the sacrifices, they were saying, by their actions, I am in fellowship with the atonement that's being made at the altar. But when I go down to the pagan temple and I sit and I eat, I'm saying by my actions, even if I say in my mind, well, I know the difference and I know it doesn't really mean anything. Paul's saying, you better be careful about minimizing evil, because you might find yourself in fellowship with demons as a result of your behavior. Yeah, there's no such thing as Zeus. There is such a thing as demons. Look at verse 21. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake, and it's a form of the word koinonia, of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. And then to cap off this section, shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? In a marriage, there is a healthy jealousy that happens. I don't want to see another man flirting with my wife. If it happens, You will provoke me to jealousy. And what God is saying here is, sure, you got liberty to eat meat offered to idols. You going to go and flirt with those idols? Are you going to provoke me to jealousy? And then, are we stronger than he? He's speaking to the strong brethren. The strong brethren in this passage are the ones who know it's okay to eat this meat. They know it's okay. It's not wrong in and of itself to eat this meat. You're so strong. Are you stronger than God? Be careful with your liberty. Consider the danger of minimizing evil. That's the message of this section. Consider the fact that you can become very undiscerning in the exercise of your liberty. You have the right to do something, but you are not thinking it through. And some of the ways in which we don't think it through, we think our associations won't affect us. We think that associating with these things, don't worry, it won't have any effect on me. Or we think that, if I can sow to the flesh, I can reap of the Spirit, things like that. Or we just ignore what the Bible repeatedly tells us is the deceitfulness of sin. Just ignore it. Okay? Yes, sir.
Question. Am I misremembering something? In another section, does Paul talk about we should not eat or provoke Gentiles if they don't eat a certain food? Am I misremembering something?
No, that's actually later in this chapter. Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Just hang with me. We'll be there in a second, Lord willing. Yeah. Good question. Anybody else? Okay. All right. So be careful. Be careful with your liberty. I'll give you an example, just because this occurs to me. Church camps regularly will post a dress code. And they have a very good reason for their dress code. They have thought this through. They did not just arbitrarily pick a dress code. But I often hear young people who are campers at church camp, and this is not the only application, I'm just giving you an example here, okay? I'll often hear campers that'll say, where does the Bible say how long my shorts must be? Where does it say I can't wear shorts like this, or, a cut-off shirt, or whatever, whatever the argument is. This chapter speaks to that, among other things, because this chapter says it's not just about what you have the right to do, it's also about what's best for God and his kingdom. And by the way, the bottom line of this chapter is found in verse 31. In verse 31, whether you eat or drink, talking about meat offered to idols, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. So the real question is not just what's wrong with it. Where does the Bible say I can't? The real question is, how can I glorify God? And that makes all the difference, okay? So here in this section, in verses 23 and 24, Paul says, now as a Christian, because you have liberty, that's a wonderful thing, consider your obligation to love others. He brings other people into the question, into the equation, and he's reasoning with us, and he's telling us, you've got to use your reasoning. You've got to think through these things. Consider your obligation to love other people. All things are lawful. That's liberty. But not all things are helpful. And then he says it again, all things are lawful. I've got the liberty to do this. Not all things build up. And so, as I think about my liberty, I need to think, and you need to think, about what's helpful and what builds up others. And then, as if to just drive the point home in verse 24, let no one seek his own good. It's not about me and my liberty, but rather the good of my neighbor. Because when they asked Jesus, what's the great command in the law? Jesus didn't say, use your liberty to all its fullness and glory. That wasn't his answer, was it? When they asked him, what's the great command in the law? He said, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then what? Love your neighbor as yourself. Leviticus 19:18. Well, I got liberty though, Paul. Okay, fine. How are you going to do those two things? How are you going to love God and your neighbor as yourself if you're always doing what's best for you? If you're always doing what you have the right to do? Be careful with your liberty. Consider the obligation that you have to love others. This is bottom line. All things are lawful, not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, not all things build up. It's a silly illustration, but it works. The Lord's Day, the first day of the week, starts, as far as I can tell, at midnight on Saturday night. What if the eldership came along and said, we would like to have worship services. We just think it'd be more spiritual and better for us if we had worship services at 12:30 a.m. on Sunday morning. Do we have the liberty to do that? All things are lawful, but not everything is helpful, right? And not everything builds up. It's a silly illustration, but that's Paul's point. Think about what's best for the biggest number of your neighbors. Think about what's best individually, and this is an individual passage. Think about what's best individually for the good of your neighbor. How can I bless my neighbors around me? He gives an illustration. This is interesting because if you just watched Paul, sometimes he might go to somebody's house and he might eat the meat that's sacrificed to idols. But then the next night he might go to somebody else's house and he might say, I'm sorry, I can't eat the meat that's sacrificed to idols. What's going on, Paul? Are you being inconsistent? Are you just kind of, put your finger in the wind and see which way the wind is blowing and that's how I make my decisions? Oh, no. Let me explain where I'm coming from, Paul says. Eat whatever's sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience, for the earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof. So what he's saying is, eating meat offered to idols, you have the liberty to do it. Go ahead, do it. If one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you're disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience. So sometimes Paul might go to an unbeliever's house and they put meat in front of him and Paul eats it. But then the next day, some other unbeliever invites Paul over and Paul says, no, I can't do it. Why is that? If someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it. For the sake of the one who informed you and for the sake of conscience, not your conscience, it's just meat offered to idols, not your conscience, but his. Think about your neighbor. Why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced for that, because of that for which I give thanks? He's saying, I still have the knowledge, I can do this acceptably, but I'm not going to do it for the sake of my neighbor's conscience. That's why. I'm going to think about what's best for my neighbor, and I'm going to consider the obligation of loving him greater than the exercise of my own personal liberty. I want to tell you something. Listen carefully. The Lord's church would function with such great love and such great harmony if we would just treat each other this way when it comes to our liberty. If we would just, for the sake of our neighbor's conscience, if we would just think about how they feel and how they are about some things that are matters of indifference, and if we just wouldn't fight about them. But John, how do we know what's a matter of indifference? How do we know what's a matter of, the Bible tells you. Let the Bible tell you what is right and is not right. And the Bible is, by the way, the final arbiter of what is and is not a matter of conscience. And you can't just decide something that you think, I don't think this is a big deal. No, it doesn't work that way. Study the scriptures and ask, what has the Lord authorized? What has the Lord said I may and may not do? Study the scriptures. Don't just arbitrarily say, well, I heard some preachers say this is a matter of judgment, so therefore it must be. No, that's not the way this works. The Word of God tells you what is and is not a matter of judgment. Your job and my job is to be discerning and to think through these things and then to ask, how can I love my neighbor? I've used the illustration before. I'm going to use it again. I don't care. I went to Tanzania. I moved there for 3.5 years. Well, for 2 years. We were going to go for 3.5 years. Moved there. When we got there, women do not wear pants. If you're wearing pants in Tanzania, especially in the cities, you are looked at as an immoral woman. That's their culture. That's the way they think. My wife did not wear pants in public for 2 years. Why? Because we sat down and we thought about their consciences, our neighbors, and we said, I don't want to give offense. I don't want to do anything that's going to offend them or somehow get in the way of the gospel or cause people to think somehow that I'm not serious about serving God, that we're not serious about serving God. So, did my wife have the liberty to wear pants? Absolutely. Nothing wrong with that. Did she do it? No. Wore a skirt every time we went out for the sake of conscience. It's what Paul's doing here. Yeah, you can do that. But is that always the only question? Can I do it? Where does the Bible say it's wrong? So, bottom line, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, okay, do all to the glory of God. He's going to give you some things to think about. Can I do this to the glory of God? Are people being edified? Are they being helped? Verses 23 and 24. Is this for their good? Those kinds of questions need to enter into the way we think about how we exercise our liberty. Not only that, do all to the glory of God, but give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church. He gives you 3 groups. The Jews, they have some scruples about some things that you can and can't eat. The Greeks, so do they. And the church has sometimes been called the third culture. You had the Jewish culture, you had the Greek culture, and now you've got the church culture. And a New Testament Christian has to be sensitive to all of that. Okay? Don't give any offense to Jews or Greeks or to the church of God. And then Paul writes, I try to please everyone in everything I do. Okay? In other passages, Paul says, I didn't come to please men, Galatians 1:10. I came to please God, not men. But he's talking here about loving your neighbor. He's talking about being sensitive to their conscience. And he says, I want to please everyone in everything I do. I don't want anything that I do to unnecessarily cause people to think that the gospel is not the most important thing in the world. Everything I do is about Christ and his gospel and the glory of God. And so I try to please everyone in everything I do. Not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. If you don't hear anything else about this lesson, understand this. The way we handle our liberty, the way we deal with it, may affect whether somebody is saved or lost. There may be souls that are lost because of the way you exercise and handle your liberty. There may be souls that are saved for the same reason. So you've got to think about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And then 11:1, the first verse of chapter 11, this is the summary. Be imitators of me as I am of Christ. Paul is telling his Christian brethren in Corinth, what you saw me do when it came to meat offered to idols while I was there in Corinth, just do that, as long as what I'm doing is following Christ. And one of the most powerful ways in which Paul taught people was, he said, this is what I do. These are the decisions I've made. Now, you make the same kinds of decisions. Follow me. And that's what he's arguing here. Be imitators of me as I am of Christ. We're not here, folks, to please ourselves. And even though God has given us liberty and he's given us abilities and he's given us rights, he's given us blessings and privileges, just because God has given us liberty does not mean that we ought to just freely and unthinkingly exercise every liberty that God's given us. If you never restrain your liberties in any way, you really need to go back and read this passage, because I promise you there will be areas in your life where you need to stop and think about what other people feel about something. You need to. Be careful with your liberty. God's given us so much and he's blessed us with so much. Don't forget those Israelites, their example, and don't be like them.